Welcome to Rewatch and Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is Charmed Season 2, Episode 7, They're Everywhere. The episode in a nutshell is just a brief summary reminder of exactly what happens within this episode. So in this episode, we follow what I would say are 2.5 plot lines. The main plot line, the main conflict of the episode is there's a man named Eric who, alongside his father, is translating a stone which is said to be a map that can lead to the Akashic records, which I don't think I pronounced that right, but anyways, the Akashic records, which are a book of prophecies for all of time throughout the earth, and this has gained them the attention of the collectors, which are a breed of warlocks that go after knowledge. And they've already gotten to Eric's dad, who is basically now without his mind and is in a hospital, which Phoebe now works at. And they want what Eric has figured out because since his dad has gone into his mindless sort of semi-coma, he has managed to translate the second half of the map. And so basically his dad figured out the latitude and he's figured out the longitude, and that will give them the location. But Phoebe, when she brushes against him, has a premonition that the collectors are going to be after him and goes home to recruit her sisters, who then help her to go, and her and Piper go to Eric's apartment, stop the collectors from getting the information in his head, bring him back to their place, where they then go to try to make a plan. But briefly, Prue and Piper realize that there may be a potential that they can't save the father, and because Eric is the one that gave her the premonition, he's their main innocent, and so therefore their priority. While they are having this discussion, Eric gets basically he's checking his messages at home. There were no messages, but then his phone rings, and it is one of the collectors calling him to say, "We got your dad. We can restore him if you come and bring us what's in your head and let us take it." So he does so. Luckily, Prue and Piper have, due to the subplot, cast a hearing thoughts spell and are able to hear the location that he's planning to go, which is Golden Gate Park, and they then head there. They go off searching. Phoebe finds them first, but because she doesn't have an active power, she ends up having part of her mind drained, enough to knock her out. Eric, when he arrives before they do, like the sisters do, he basically has them restore his father by threatening to blow his own head off, as then they would not be able to get the knowledge that is within his head, and they do restore his father, but then they do attack him. But they don't manage to take all of his mind, as that's when Phoebe interrupts. They take part of her mind. Prue then arrives and throws them off, and then again, thanks to the hearing thoughts spell, they realize that one is trying to play the decoy while the other collector sneaks up behind them, so they wait and let them think it's working, and then Piper freezes them. Prue moves them together, and they end up basically vanquishing each other by taking each other's minds. And then we have our subplot, which led to the hearing thoughts spell, which was that Prue was at her getting like a coffee, and then she turns around and goes to a magazine stand, and she sees Jack in the coffee line, and then almost immediately he's at the magazine stand, and she thinks he blinked and therefore thinks that he may be a warlock. And because she thinks that he may be a warlock, she comes home all in a panic to Piper, basically being like, "Is there a warlock test? I think you would know because you've dated a warlock before," because Piper still hasn't lived down Jeremy from season 1, episode 1. And Piper is like, "Well, no, and now I'm with Dan, and he's definitely human. You know, the cat hasn't hissed at him. He hasn't tried to kill us, blah, blah, blah." But then she opens the door to Dan, and Kit hisses, and she thinks it's at Dan, so then she's on board for trying to figure out whether or not their boyfriends are warlocks. They do the hearing thoughts spell to try to figure out from what they're thinking whether or not they are warlocks, because there is no specific test in the Book of Shadows. However, when Phoebe does come home, she tells them that warlocks do not bleed, so if they prick Dan and Jack, if they bleed, they are not warlocks, which they both bleed, so they are then not warlocks. And we find out on Prue's side that the reason that she thought they blinked was actually that Jack is a twin. And then the half plot that's kind of also underlining this is with Dan as well. There's the sidetracking into him being a warlock, but then there's also the fact that Piper has planned an overnight trip with Dan that she almost misses due to the drama with Eric, though luckily at the last minute she manages to get there and freeze him before he can pull out of the driveway so that she is able to go on the trip with him after all. So now that we're reminded of what happens in the episode, it's time to rank the episode. We rank on two lists, a mostly objective ranking list, which is set values, though bias and judgment can still apply, and the personal ranking, which is based on the emotional opinion of the episode. So we'll start with those mostly objective rank values that I felt did apply to this episode. And as always, we start with our single episode supporting character introductions, which in the case of this episode, we have 1 point for Eric Bragg, who is our innocent, and then another for Jeff Sheridan, which is, of course, Jack's twin brother. We then, of course, have our multi-episode supporting character development, which is the fact that Jack, in fact, has a twin named Jeff. And then we have our multi-season main character development, which is the fact that Phoebe has a job. Last we had heard anything about this, she was unemployed and had been so for some time. And now randomly in this episode, at some point between the previous episode and this one, she is now working in a hospital or care home. It's not really clear, but I think they said hospital as some sort of like assistant. She doesn't, as far as I know, she hasn't gone to school to be a nurse or a doctor, so she would be maybe like a candy striper type thing, like somebody who's helping out at the hospital. It could even be volunteer, like it may not even be paid because, like I said, she doesn't have the education for being like a nurse or a doctor. But she is in the room, she's, putting out the flowers that are sent in for the patients, etc., etc. But anyways, she got a job, that's 4 points. And then we have our world building, which is the existence of these Akashic records, which of course, as I mentioned before, is a book of prophecy that basically records every significant event that will impact the Earth for the entirety of human history, both in the past and into the future. And if that was in the hands of evil, obviously the world would be in a very bad position. We then also find out how to test if your boyfriend is a warlock. Apparently, warlocks do not bleed, so if you prick them, then and they bleed, then they are human. If they do not bleed, then they are a warlock. And that is worth 4 points for the world building. And then our last positive is, of course, our main relationship developments, which is honorably mentioned. We'll say that Prue kind of has that flirtation going on with Jack. He's serious enough about it that he's sending in his twin, which is something that they've always done when they're interested in somebody. And at the end of the episode, he does send her flowers with a phone in it to try to ask her to dinner, but she does say no at that point. At this point, they're not overly serious yet. But it's not worth honorably mentioning. And then we have the main relationship development for this episode that is worth the points, which is the 4-point addition. And that is Piper obviously has moved to the point with Dan in the relationship that they are going to be going on an overnight trip together. And she does briefly question whether he is a warlock, but it turns out that Kit was hissing at hornets that had built a hive on their porch, not at Dan, and of course Dan passes the test when pricked. And then there was a brief time of whether or not it was going to work out with her being able to make the trip, but at the end she does actually make the trip and is able to go on this overnighter with Dan, showing that their relationship is moving forward and developing. And that brings us to 16 for our positive score so far. However, there were a couple of negatives. So the first negative, of course, is with regards to character regression. Now, what I feel was the character regression, and this kind of is always the case, is that the the hearing thoughts spell, it was personal gain, and yet the show doesn't really stay consistent ever with whether or not there are going to be consequences for personal gain or not. In this case, they cast the to hear the inner thoughts spell with the purpose of hearing their boyfriend's thoughts to find out if they are warlocks, which is a very selfish purpose. And then in the end, it does end up being very helpful to them in defeating the collectors, which may be why they avoid personal gain. But the intention for which they cast the spell was entirely personal gain related. So I feel like there should have been, to stay consistent in the show, a consequence for using that spell as personal gain. But it could also be similar to the truth spell, where the consequences are that you have to remember what it is you heard, even if you didn't necessarily like it. Though in this case, like, they didn't really hear anything that was something they wouldn't like they did in The Truth Is Out There and It Hurts. So it was a regression because they're using personal gain when they know that they shouldn't, but at the same time, it's also calling out the show for not staying consistent on the personal gain side of things. Though, like I said, there could be potentially a reason for that. It's just not a very good one. Anyways, it's worth -1. There's also kind of a return of the daddy issues because Eric's stepfather wants him in his life, and Eric, of course, wants to save his father. And for the sisters, their father is gone, came in briefly in Thank You for Not Morphing, and then was gone again and has not returned to the show. And so, but that's very briefly mentioned. And overall, the reason I'm not necessarily counting it for points, but more honorably mentioning it, is because when she does bring up kind of the daddy issues, you can see it kind of affects her, but she also says kind of that she's over her dad Hunt from season 1 that she had in the first few episodes, which also shows that, it's not necessarily a backslide on it, it's just that it's something that continues to affect her. And then the next positive is, of course, our negative messaging and behavior, and this is more for consistency's sake. What the collectors are after is the knowledge that Eric and his father gained from a stone that is a coded map to these acoustic records, and to prevent anybody else in the future from being able to find the location that Eric knows, he decides to break into a museum, and then he decides to break the artifact in broad daylight with Phoebe by his side. And obviously, nobody should ever be breaking into museums and destroying potentially priceless artifacts. So that's going to be our negative messaging and behaviors. Which brings our overall score to 13. Now, I do have a bit of a conundrum with this show going forward, and this is with regards to supporting relationship developments. A lot of times, if the sisters are not in a committed or semi-committed relationship, the relationship in its entirety starts in that episode and then ends in that episode. So, for example, in this episode, we have a flirtation with Phoebe. They're flirting a bit when she's helping his dad. Then she gets her premonition. They flirt a bit throughout the back and forth trying to save his father. And then at the end of the episode, because they've both lost about like 3 weeks of their memories or so, they don't remember each other anymore. So all of their flirtation went out the window and they obviously don't end up in any sort of relationship. Now, this one was again mild because it starts and stops in the same episode. The scores cancel each other out. So my conundrum is whether or not I include these going forward or not. I haven't included them here because, like I said, they cancel each other out. But if anybody who is watching has an opinion on whether or not it's worth putting in a supporting relationship in there, even though the scores cancel out just for the sake of being able to talk about it, is worth it. Or if it does have any sort of main impact, then I can always talk about it on the personal side. But I am in a bit of a conundrum, and I'm unsure going forward what to do about these single episode little flirtations that they sometimes have, and whether that's even worth noting or mentioning because the scores end up canceling out. However, back to the topic at hand, 13 was the final score, which makes this episode a 10 out of 10 episode. So as a reminder of our season 2 rankings so far in our mostly objective ranking, in first place we have Witch Trial, The Painted World, She's a Man Baby, a Man. In fourth place, this episode is They're Everywhere. In fifth, Morality Bites, That Old Black Magic, and then The Devil's Music. As a reminder, the reason that it falls into fourth is that on the mostly objective list, whenever more than one episode has the same ranking, we place it on the list in the episode it aired, like the order that the episode aired in. And that is why, even though it's 10 out of 10, it's in fourth. So now we're on to our personal ranking list. So overall, I didn't hate the episode, but I also didn't find it overly engaging or entertaining emotionally. Like, it didn't really grab my interest. It was kind of something that if I wasn't making these rewatch videos specifically, I probably would have had on as like background noise while I was instead playing like a MOBA game or just doing anything else, maybe cleaning, maybe doing something more productive while it played in the background because it just wasn't one that I found engaging. There wasn't any standout negatives necessarily, other than that it just wasn't as entertaining. I did enjoy like the side plot with the romances, that like plot and a half of the Prue and Jack having a twin, them swapping places, Prue and Piper being worried that Dan and Jack were warlocks, and then, Piper almost missing her trip, but that wasn't really enough to bring it up. With the main plot, it's like again, it's like there's a save the world sort of feeling to it, similar to the last episode where they've set up this really big, the world will end if evil gets this thing, but then it just kind of is like, and then they save the day and nothing actually happened, and that was it. And I feel like when you have like these big end of the world things, like in the future, as this is a rewatch, in the future, they'll have like a main villain that kind of goes throughout some of the season or a full season, maybe a couple of seasons, where it's this big thing that they're trying to stop that takes them several episodes to get to. And I feel like you have to work for it. And I'm like, that feels better than we had this really big thing and it was so easy to solve. It took us one episode and not even the full episode because we still had subplots. And then, of course, there was the whole pointless flirting with Phoebe when it wasn't going to work out anyways because they took her memory and it just feels like I wasted my time and my emotional investment. There was, like, even with the hearing thoughts thing, that could have been done, like, to great comedic effect, and to a certain extent it has. It was, but I felt like, again, they could have done more with it, where there was nothing negative about it. They did use it. There was some good moments with it, some misunderstandings that came up that then later get resolved, such as the fact that Jeff owns a line of mortuaries, so he's thinking about how, he buries bodies, burns bodies, and this makes Prue think, oh, definitely a warlock. And then once it's revealed that he's his twin, and Piper asks, what do you do for a living? And they find out about the mortuaries, it's like, oh, that's why he said those things. Wasn't that he was a warlock, it was that that is his business, literally. Obviously, there's kind of a double standard on Prue's side. Like, she spends the entire episode hearing his thoughts, doing the prick test to determine if Jack is a warlock, and yet somehow is upset that he would send in his twin to kind of gain an impression on Prue and whether there's something he's missing because of his feelings that the twin might be able to pick up on because the twin doesn't have those feelings. Kind of like those red flags that you're blind to when you're emotionally involved, that somebody non-emotionally involved might be able to pick up better, and using your twin to do that. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it is tricking them, but then at the same time, she was kind of magically doing her own tests. So I feel like it's a bit of a double standard in this particular case. And then there's just the overall, like, when they go to break the stone in the museum, they go into the museum in broad daylight. There are other patrons of the museum all around them. He takes out a fire extinguisher, he smashes the glass, he breaks the stone. People see and gasp and clutch their pearls that he has broken the stone. There's a museum, it's got an alarm, it's got security cameras, it's got security personnel, and yet somehow they are able to just like waltz right out. And at least as far as we can tell within the show, no consequences whatsoever for that. Like, maybe no one knows who Eric is, but like, the police would investigate. The police have Daryl. Daryl knows who Phoebe is. I do not understand how she would have gotten away with that. That would be a really big incident. That would be on the news. That would probably be like national news, maybe even international news. I mean, this is a museum. This is a priceless artifact. This is a coded map to this mythical, akashic records and prophecy book. Like, this is a pretty big thing. He just smashes it and gets away with it. And like, even Phoebe not being the one to smash it, she was clearly together with him. They went in together. She stood next to him while he did that. And then as they are leaving, he grabs her hand and they run out hand in hand. So there's no way to say Phoebe wasn't involved or like she didn't know what he was doing necessarily. Like, she was a little bit surprised. But again, like, when the police are investigating, Dale would be able to identify Phoebe and then see that she's holding hands with the guy who was obviously part of it, even if she didn't smash it herself. And I would think she'd be questioned. I feel like that's a big loophole that they just kind of forgot about. And it never comes up in any future episodes. There's no legal troubles, and they've gotten in legal troubles for far less. So that also was a kind of like, I don't know. It just doesn't feel like they really thought out that part of the plot. Like, even when Prue went in and stole the feather, it was a mere feather, but she at least waited until it was after dark and like actually snuck in. Whereas they went in broad daylight, middle of the day when other patrons were there and everything. Like, it just makes no sense that they had no consequences. But to a couple of the cute moments, just to end more on a positive note, there was a peacock in the park that scared Prue, and anybody who's been watching my videos for a while probably knows already that peacocks are my favorite bird. I think they are adorable. I love their fan. They're beautiful. And so I was very thrilled to see a peacock in the park. I noted it down. I made a special note that there was a peacock in the park. So I thought it was worth mentioning. And then, of course, at the very, very end of the episode, I mentioned that Prue got a phone in the flowers she received from Jack. And basically it starts ringing. She answers it. Her and Phoebe are sharing a chair together and like holding the phone between them and basically consulting each other while they talk to Jack. And then Phoebe starts making the static noises alongside Prue, who pretends the phone's breaking up before they hang up on him. And I thought that was a great, cute scene for like the sibling behavior. At this point, Piper's not there because she's already left with Dan. So overall, no major, major negatives, just like really the lack of consequences to any of the actions that took place in the episode, but also some good moments. I felt it was average, and so I decided to give it a 5 out of 10 on our personal ranking, which then brings the season 2 personal ranking so far to in first place Witch Trial, then The Painted World. This one I put in third, They're Everywhere, She's a Man, Baby, a Man, The Devil's Music, Morality Bites, and then in 7th is That Old Black Magic. And now we come to our series ranking so far. With our mostly objective ranking in Season 1, we came to 73.18%. And in Season 2 so far, we are up to 55 out of 220. And then on our personal side, Season 1 ended with 71.50%, and Season 2 so far has reached 28 out of 220. And with that, we've now rewatched and ranked Charmed Season 2, Episode 7. They're everywhere. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.